The sun had barely risen when she heard it. Not wind, not footsteps, but something softer. A sound like breath meeting wood. Ellie stepped onto her porch, mug in hand, expecting silence. But instead, she found him, small, trembling, collapsed on the step like the forest had exhaled and left a secret at her door. A wild bobcat kitten, dying, alone, and without thinking, she did what no one expected. She knelt, wrapped him in her hoodie, and brought him inside. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know how this would end, only that something had just begun. The wind that morning didn't howl, it whispered, stirred the dry leaves, kissed the glass of Ellie's kitchen window, then slipped beneath the door like a cautious guest. Ellie Marston, 28, stood barefoot on the porch of the cedar cabin she'd been renting since May. A steaming mug warmed her palms, the scent of chamomile and mint rising with the steam. Her eyes were still soft with sleep, her hair pulled into a lazy bun. Out here, 2 hours from the nearest Starbucks and miles from anyone who remembered her name from med school, she was learning how to just be. She hadn't planned to become someone who lived in a cabin with no Wi-Fi and read poetry by firelight. But plans had a way of unraveling. She took a sip, her gaze on the gravel path beyond the porch steps. Something moved, not big, not loud, just wrong. At first, she thought it was a shadow, maybe a pile of leaves stirred by wind. But the movement was uneven, twitching, then still. Ellie lowered her mug slowly. There, not 5 feet from her boots, lay a small creature, its coat matted and dirtied, the pattern faintly spotted like a watercolor painting faded in the rain. Tiny ribs fluttered with shallow breaths, ears trembled, tipped with black tufts. She crouched. Slowly, heart thrumming. It wasn't a kitten. Not in the way people think of kittens. Its paws were too large, the muzzle slightly squared, wild. "Bobcat," her brain whispered. But her body didn't move away. Instead, she reached back behind her and grabbed the faded blue hoodie she'd draped over the porch railing, the one that still smelled like rain and sleep. "Hey there," she murmured, more breath than voice. "You're okay." The kitten didn't flinch. It didn't run. It couldn't. When she wrapped the hoodie around it, she felt the delicate bones beneath its fur, the warmth of its breath against her wrist. It made no sound. She carried it inside as gently as one would cradle a lost secret. The cabin was dim, soft morning light slanting through gauzy curtains. She cleared a spot on the couch, laying down a folded towel. The kitten didn't stir when she placed it there. Its eyes opened once, pale green, clouded with something she couldn't name. Not quite fear, not quite pain, just surrender. Ellie sat on the floor, back against the coffee table, arms wrapped around her knees. "What are you doing here?" she asked, as if the kitten could answer. The silence felt too still, too heavy. She reached for her phone, fingers fumbling. Searched. What to do if you find an injured wild animal? Most results mention calling wildlife services. Don't touch it. Don't bring it inside. Too late. She didn't regret it. She watched the rise and fall of its side. So slow but steady. She remembered her last ER shift, the flashing monitors, the sterile lights. The ache in her chest when she realized the machines kept going even when the people didn't. She hadn't been back since, and yet here, now, a wild heartbeat had landed at her feet. Literally, the kettle hissed from the stove. She got up, made a hot water bottle, and tucked it beside the kitten's flank beneath the hoodie. It shivered once, then went still. Ellie didn't know what tomorrow would ask of her. She didn't know if this tiny creature would survive the day, but she knew now, in that moment. She wasn't going to let it die alone on her porch. Ellie didn't sleep. Not really. She dozed in shifts, curled up on the old armchair with her knees pulled to her chest, eyes fluttering open at every sound, or the lack of it. The Bobcat Kitten lay swaddled in her hoodie, barely moving. Every so often, its breath hitched, and she would rise, silently, crouch beside the couch, and watch to make sure its chest still rose again. At 2:17 a.m. it stirred. It wasn't a full movement, just a twitch of the tail, a sound that could have been a sigh or a whimper. Ellie leaned in, speaking gently, though her voice caught on the dryness in her throat. "Still with me, huh?" Her hand hovered just above the tiny head, unsure whether comfort would help or scare it. Then, very slowly, she lowered her fingers to the soft space behind its ears. It didn't flinch. She let her fingertips rest there. The kitten was warm now. That was something. By morning, the chill had lifted from the cabin floor, and a fog hung thick over the grass outside. Ellie stepped into the light with the fragile sense of a survivor waking after a storm. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. She brewed a small pot of coffee but didn't touch it. Her stomach was too tight. Instead, she called Montana Wildlife Rescue, emergency line. A man answered, gruff, half asleep. She gave her name, her address, explained what had happened. The words felt surreal as they left her mouth. "It's a bobcat kitten. It just collapsed outside. I brought it in. It's alive, but weak." There was a long pause on the other end. "Do not attempt to feed it," the man finally said. "Keep it warm. Don't handle it more than necessary. We can be there tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" "We don't have transport staff in your region until then. If it gets worse, I'm not going to let it get worse." Her voice came out sharper than she meant. Another pause, then, "Okay, we'll prioritize you. Hang in there." She hung up, sat on the floor, watched the sun crawl across the cabin wall like a lazy traveler, and then she did what she hadn't done in months. She opened the bottom cabinet of the kitchen island and pulled out her old medical kit. It was battered and incomplete, a relic of her past life in the city. But it still held gauze, saline, gloves. "I know I'm not supposed to," she whispered, looking over at the kitten. But you're not going to make it through another night like this." She boiled a kettle, sterilized a dropper. She mixed a solution, a trick she'd learned on a pediatric rotation years ago. Sugar, salt, warm water, barely a teaspoon. When she approached the couch, the kitten's eyes were open, dull, distant. She lowered herself slowly, her knees pressed into the rug. "It's okay," she said, unsure if she meant for him or herself. "Just this once." It took 10 minutes to get 2 drops into its mouth, but after the first one, the kitten swallowed. After the second, it blinked, slow and heavy. And then it let out the smallest sound, a chirp. Ellie laughed, or cried, maybe both. She called it Fig that afternoon, after the fig tree in the backyard that had somehow survived late frost and deer raids. Fig. It felt right. She placed a shallow dish of warm water near the couch. Left the room. Returned with a pillow and a notebook she hadn't touched in months. For hours, they existed in a kind of suspended stillness. Every few minutes, Fig would twitch or shift. Once, he stretched one leg, as if testing whether it still worked. In the quiet, Ellie wrote, "He looked at me like he remembered something, not me. But the shape of a hand, the sound of breath that wasn't dangerous. By dusk, Fig was upright, not walking, not playing, but sitting, staring out the cabin window. His ears rotated slightly with every bird call. Ellie sat across the room, watching him watch the world. "I think you want to go back," she whispered. "I think I'm just to stop on your map." Fig turned his head, looked at her, then closed his eyes and breathed. It was more than survival now. It was something close to trust. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that neither Ellie nor Fig had anticipated. Each morning began with the hush of cold light spilling across the wooden floorboards, the kettle whistling softly as Ellie prepared 2 bowls, one for her oats, one with finely diced chicken softened in broth. It had taken Fig 2 full days to accept food from her hand. Now he waited for it, not with expectation, but with cautious patience, as if reminding her he hadn't chosen to be tamed, only to trust. He moved through the cabin like a question mark, quiet, graceful, always watching. Sometimes he'd vanish behind the couch, curled into the soft hollow of an old blanket. Other times he'd leap without warning onto the windowsill, his nose pressed to the glass, body trembling at the sound of distant rustling beyond the pines. Ellie worked at the kitchen table again, not on shift schedules or patient charts, but on short poems, journal entries, small sketches. At first, she didn't share the space with him. It felt like trying to write with someone breathing down her shoulder. But Fig, surprisingly, respected boundaries. He never stepped on the pages, never pawed at her pens. Instead, he would curl near the leg of the chair, close enough to hear her breath, far enough to keep his autonomy. One afternoon, while Ellie typed a line about silence and pine needles, she heard the thump of a paw against the glass. She turned to see Fig crouched at the base of the sliding door, staring intently at the golden blur of a leaf spiraling downward. He chirped, a short, bright sound. Ellie smiled. "You found your voice." Later, when the leaf skidded close, he pounced, clumsy, joyful, too fast for his own strength. He skidded on the polished floor and crashed into the baseboard. The noise was startling, a heavy thud followed by silence. Ellie shot up from her chair, her heart suddenly lurching. "Fig!" she called, already kneeling. He lay still for a breath, then rolled over dramatically, paws in the air, and blinked up at her. She gasped, then laughed, then cried. "You little manipulative fur goblin," she whispered, running a hand through her tangled hair. That was a full performance. He flicked his ear and stretched. That night, he slept beside the fireplace, not in her hoodie, not in a towel nest, just there, like he belonged. Ellie curled up on the couch nearby, half reading, half watching the flicker of firelight reflect in his eyes. "He's going to have to go back," she reminded herself. "He's not mine." But there was something about the way he had claimed the space without needing to own it, something about the quiet between them that made her ache. Not with fear, not with loneliness, but with the dull, persistent tug of attachment. She'd been warned. The wildlife officer on the phone had told her clearly, "Do not treat it like a pet. It's temporary care, not a bond." But it was already too late. On the 3rd day, Fig jumped onto the bed. It was dusk. Rain tapped softly on the tin roof. Ellie had been curled up, lost in a half-dream state, the edges of her consciousness fraying into memory and sensation, and then a pressure, small and warm. She opened her eyes to find Fig standing at her side, tail arched delicately, pupils wide in the low light. He didn't meow, didn't chirp. He lay down, head resting lightly on her hip, one paw outstretched until it touched the hem of her shirt. She didn't move, barely breathed. Something settled in her chest, a stillness she hadn't known she was missing. Outside, wind sighed through the birches. A branch scratched the cabin wall. Fig's ears twitched once, then stilled. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, placing a hand softly on his back. His breathing slowed, matched hers. The rain continued. The clock ticked once, twice, then forgot to tick at all. In that timeless quiet, Ellie felt something she hadn't let herself feel in months. Peace. It was Thursday when the world called back. The sound came just after noon, a truck engine crunching slowly over gravel, too heavy to be a delivery van, too deliberate to be lost. Ellie was on the porch, sipping tea, Fig asleep in the corner by the potted rosemary. She stood without thinking, the mug forgotten in her hand. The white pickup bore the Montana wildlife emblem on the driver's side door, and a sticker near the back window. Respect wild things. The man who stepped out wore a forest green jacket, worn at the elbows, and a face that had seen more animals than people lately. "Miss Marston?" he called, his tone calm but practiced. Ellie stepped forward. "Yes. I'm Nolan Keats, Wildlife Services. We spoke Monday." He glanced at the porch, at the sloping hills beyond the trees. "You still have the kitten?" She nodded. He waited, polite. "May I?" She opened the screen door and gestured for him to enter. The floor creaked softly under his boots. Fig didn't move, not at first. His ears flicked. Then he lifted his head and blinked at the stranger. No growl, no panic. But there was a shift. A low, alert silence. "That's him?" Nolan asked, voice softer now. "Yeah," she said. "That's Fig." The officer crouched slowly, didn't reach out, just watched. "He's bigger than I expected," he murmured. "Healthier, too." "I fed him," Ellie admitted, a defensive edge in her voice. "I know I wasn't supposed to, but he was starving." Nolan didn't argue, just nodded. "You did well, better than most people would have." She waited for the but. It came gently. "But he can't stay." Ellie sat on the arm of the couch just behind Fig. Her hands were clasped too tightly in her lap. "I know," she whispered. "I knew that from the beginning. It's just, he's not afraid of me anymore." "That's the problem," Nolan said. "He's still young. If he stays too long, he'll imprint. It gets harder to rewild them." "I didn't imprint him," she said quickly. I was here." "He chose me?" Nolan gave her a long look. "You ever think maybe you chose each other?" That undid something. She stood abruptly, walking to the kitchen just to put space between herself and the ache that threatened to rise in her throat. She busied her hands wiping an already clean counter. Behind her, Fig shifted, jumped lightly to the floor and padded to her side. He leaned against her calf, tail curling lightly around her ankle. "I'll take him to a partner center near Missoula," Nolan continued. "They've got experience with bobcat kits. Open land, monitored rehab. He'll have other wildlings to learn from." "And then you'll release him?" she asked, not turning. "If he passes the tests." "If he stays wild enough." His voice softened. "He's got a good chance. You gave him that." She turned finally, looked at Fig. He looked back. Still wild, still hers. Not to keep, just to witness, just to remember. "I'll get the hoodie," she said. The morning of goodbye came without announcement. No wind, no birdsong, just the steady, low hum of a world quietly preparing for change. Ellie stood in the doorway of the cabin, a folded hoodie pressed against her chest, like a memory still warm. Fig was curled at the base of the fireplace, stretched long across the faded rug, the same rug he'd shredded twice, then claimed as his own without apology. His eyes were closed, but she could see the movement beneath his lids. Dreaming, maybe. A tall grass and birdsong he'd never truly heard. The truck rolled in just after 10. Gravel whispered under tires. The sound didn't stir him. Ellie opened the door before Nolan could knock. He gave her a gentle nod, a soft smile that didn't reach all the way. "You ready?" he asked. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. Nolan stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the space like someone entering a cathedral. Quiet, reverent. He carried a soft-sided carrier in one hand, its interior already lined with straw and a fleece blanket. Ellie had asked if she could use her hoodie instead. He said yes. Now, as she knelt to unzip the carrier, she tucked the navy blue hoodie into the corner. It still smelled faintly of rosemary, wood smoke, and something wilder, something that had become fig. "Do I need to?" she started. "No rush," Nolan said. "Let him come on his own if he's willing." She turned back to Fig, who was awake now, eyes half-lidded, watching her the way he always did, like she was a language he didn't fully understand, but liked hearing anyway. She knelt beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his body. He didn't flinch, didn't move away. Her fingers brushed his fur, slow and feather-light. She had learned his edges, the curve of his shoulder blades, the soft pad behind his ears. She had learned, without instruction, how to be near something that didn't belong to her and love it anyway. "You don't have to be brave," she whispered, "but you do have to go." He blinked. Then, with the kind of grace that always took her breath, he rose to his feet, shook himself once, and stepped forward. Not toward the door, not toward the trees, but into her lap. She let out a breath that broke a little at the edges. Fig curled into her for a long moment, pressing his face against the crook of her elbow. And then, as if it had all been agreed upon silently, he turned and padded toward the carrier. He entered it without resistance. The zipper closed with a sound that felt final. Ellie sat back on her heels, her hands suddenly cold without him. Nolan lifted the carrier gently, holding it like something sacred. "He's got a good chance," he said. "They've got space up north, forest, ledges, cover. We'll do slow integration. If he responds well, in a few weeks, he'll be free." She nodded, though her throat felt too narrow for words. On the porch, Nolan paused. "He'll forget," she said, the words surprising her. "Some things, maybe," he answered. "But not all. Animals don't forget safety, or warmth, or kindness. They just tuck it away." He stepped off the porch. The carrier didn't move, but she imagined she could feel the weight shift with every step. She didn't follow him to the truck. She stood at the top of the steps, her arms wrapped tight across her middle, her breath thin. The door closed. The ignition turned. Then, just as the truck backed out of the drive, the carrier shifted, and a small face appeared behind the mesh. 2 green eyes, steady, unafraid. She lifted her hand. He didn't blink. The truck disappeared around the bend. The forest closed behind them. Inside, the cabin exhaled. She wandered back in slowly, unsure what to do with her hands. Everything looked unchanged. The bowl by the fireplace, the scratches in the floor. The corner where Fig had hidden behind a curtain and refused to come out for a full day. She knelt and picked up something near the couch, a single whisker, curved like a question mark. She turned it between her fingers, then placed it gently in the center of her journal, pressed between 2 blank pages. That night, she didn't sleep in her bed. She laid out her sleeping bag by the fireplace, lit a single candle, and left the door cracked open just enough for the wind to pass through. Somewhere out there, he was learning how to climb real trees, how to stalk shadows, how to disappear. But once, for a few days in October, he had chosen her. And that would be enough. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. No return address. Just a wildlife centre emblem stamped faintly in the corner, smudged by rain. Ellie almost didn't notice it in the stack of grocery circulars and utility reminders. But something about the paper, the texture, maybe, made her pause. She stood by the kitchen sink, unopened mail in one hand, the other still damp from rinsing blueberries. Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass beside the porch. A goldfinch darted through the stillness, gone before its shadow touched the window. She set the fruit aside, opened the envelope. Inside, one folded letter and a photo printed on matte paper. She lifted the photo first. There he was, Fig, sitting beneath a low pine, his ears perked, body taut with focus. His coat was fuller now, thicker around the neck, deeper in colour. He looked older, wilder, his eyes still green, still searching, and wrapped loosely around his paw, unmistakable, was a scrap of navy blue fabric. Her hoodie. She pressed the photo against her chest and closed her eyes. Then she read, "Dear Ellie, Fig is doing well, better than we'd hoped, honestly. He passed all his early assessments and has begun the next phase, controlled forest exposure with no human contact. He's cautious, curious, and exceptionally responsive to the world around him. We found him dragging a piece of fabric from his crate into the den space. He sleeps with it curled beside him. We're letting him keep it through this next stage. He's become something of a symbol to the team here. A reminder that wild doesn't mean broken, and human care doesn't always mean dependence. If all continues as it has, Fig will be released mid-winter. The terrain has been selected, remote, rich with prey, and most importantly, empty of people. Thank you for the part you played. I don't think we could have saved him without you. With gratitude, Nolan Keats, Montana Wildlife Services." She read it again, slower. The part that caught her was not release or responsive or even saved. It was that word, symbol. He had become more than just a bobcat kitten with bad timing and lucky instincts. He had become a story they told at meetings, a presence that reminded people what was possible when fear didn't win. She set the letter down and walked out onto the porch, the photo still in her hand. The sky was low with clouds, the kind that pressed gently on the tops of trees without raining. The air was cool, edged with the scent of pine bark and old smoke. She sat, thought about the first night. The weight of him on her chest, the heat of his body. How he'd blinked at her with something ancient behind his eyes. Something that knew loneliness and safety could live in the same room. There were no tears, just stillness. She reached into the journal on the side table and tucked the letter and photo between 2 pages. Later, maybe, she'd write a poem. Or maybe not. Some stories didn't need words, they just needed remembering. By winter, the wind had changed. It came down from the ridgeline, colder now, sharper, tugging through the bare trees like a forgotten tune. Ellie stood at the edge of her porch, wrapped in an old flannel jacket, a mug of tea held close to her lips. The trees were hushed. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Somewhere beyond those pines, a bobcat now moved freely. His paws silent on frost-covered ground, his breath curling into the air like ghost light. She imagined him leaping, stretching, learning which branches held firm and which snapped beneath weight. She imagined his eyes glowing faintly in moonlight, alert, alone, but not lost. She didn't need to see him again. She only needed to know he'd become what he was always meant to be. And in some small, invisible way, so had she. The porch creaked beneath her as she stepped back inside. The hoodie was gone. But she kept the whisker, pressed in the journal, a thread between worlds, wild and human. Temporary and eternal, some stories leave without warning. Some arrive clawed and breathless, but a rare few, settle in the quiet parts of us, where instinct meets memory and presence becomes its own kind of love. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories, we believe some bonds never end.